The court effectively creates a law-free zone around the president, upsetting the status quo that has existed since the founding. This new official acts immunity now lies about like a loaded weapon for any president that wishes to place his own interests, his own political survival, or his own financial gain above the interests of the nation.
Hello, and welcome to Sidebar, a podcast from Courthouse News. I'm your host, Kirk McDaniel. I'm here today with our Supreme Court reporter, Kelsey Reichman. Kelsey, did I miss something? Did the Supreme Court really make presidents above the law?
Depends on who you ask. The clip you just heard was Justice Sonia Sotomayor's dissent read from the bench when her conservative colleagues ruled to give President Donald Trump broad immunity from criminal prosecutions. Whether or not you think Trump is above the law in practice or in theory, the High Court's decision last July in Trump v. United States feels particularly poignant while his administration faces over 100 lawsuits less than 100 days into his second term.
And as a quick reminder for our listeners, what did the justices say in that decision?
The case stemmed from former special counsel Jack Smith's D.C. prosecution against Trump for election interference in 2020. In the 6-3 ruling, the Supreme Court said presidents have absolute immunity for actions that are core powers of the executive branch. Any action outside of that core authority could also have some immunity.
But what exactly is a core presidential power?
Aha, that's what I'd like to discuss. As soon as Trump walked back into the Oval Office this January, he flexed a newfound executive authority untouched by any of his predecessors. Welcome to the age of the Imperial Presidency.
Imperial Presidency. As in an autocrat?
That's essentially the idea. Total control over the federal government. The term was popularized in the 1970s to describe the increasing power of the presidency. In the years since, presidents have continued to stretch executive authority. But, of course, Trump goes about 10 steps further. Trump believes that every federal government agency and employee answers directly to him. While the president appoints political heads to government departments, the federal government operates through around 3 million civil service employees. Unlike their political leaders, civil service workers stay at their post regardless of the executive office holder. Trump broke from that policy, firing thousands of federal workers in the weeks after retaking the White House.
So Trump fired federal workers by the thousands. Doesn't he have the power to do that, though?
Yes and no. Federal workers are protected from at-will termination in all but a few cases, such as misconduct. Trump could lay off civil service workers, but he'd have to use a more attenuated process. So, Trump's solution was to issue mass terminations based on poor performance, even though many employees said they'd never received a bad review, and others weren't even on the job long enough to have a review at all. Trump's justification for firing those workers relies on a broad interpretation of Article 2 of the Constitution. Legal scholars refer to this theory of presidential power as the unitary executive.
Meaning he has sole control over the entire executive branch.
That's the theory, at least. I spoke with two senior fellows at the Center for American Progress, Michael Sozan and Ben Olinsky, about a report they wrote about the Project 2025 blueprint for the second Trump administration, the U.S. system of checks and balances, and the Imperial Presidency. Here's how Sozan described the unitary executive.
What we're talking about here, because you're right, it's a very large topic, is the attempt by a president, specifically our current president, to amass as much power for himself as possible and to really weaken the system of checks and balances that has existed in our government for 250 years, where Congress and the judicial branch are seen as co-equal branches. And one of the ways to amass this sort of power and to create an imperial presidency, as Ben and I called it in our report, is through the unitary executive theory. And that theory essentially says that a president can control the vast federal bureaucracy completely under his power and not share it with Congress as has traditionally been done.
Okay, but like you said, this is all a theory. What would a unitary executive look like in practice?
Well, pretty much everything Trump has done in the first few months of office can be traced back to his view of presidential power. Claiming to end birthright citizenship, slashing grant funding, gutting federal agencies, deporting migrants to mega prisons in El Salvador. You get the point. But let's break this down by looking at Trump firing heads of independent agencies. Unlike the CDC or the FBI, these are nonpartisan bureaus created by Congress, and they typically function as some kind of check on power. Alinsky, who is also the center's senior vice president of structural reform and governance, gave me a few examples.
The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, what is it that they do? They're one of those independent agencies. They try to lower your overdraft fees and other kinds of penalties and fees that banks offer or impose on you as a consumer. And they had lowered the cap on overdraft fees, but now, that's at risk. You have investigations into companies who literally are just committing fraud and stealing your money. The Federal Trade Commission, they have put forward a rule to stop non-compete agreements. And, there was that example of one sandwich making company that had non-compete agreements for their sandwich makers within a certain number of miles. That was just absolutely ludicrous and actually hurt people. You have the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, that you have a chair now who wants to go after broadcasters and maybe even delicense them because they air stuff that the president doesn't like. If they delicensed some broadcasters, you might not be able to get your local sports games. I mean, this is stuff that will actually affect Americans. I think they haven't seen it yet, but if this continues, they will.
Trump's commandeering of these agencies led to dozens of lawsuits. Courthouse News' DC federal courts reporter Ryan Knappenberger is covering multiple lawsuits challenging Trump's terminations.
Immediately after taking office, Trump began terminating independent agency heads throughout the executive branch with these curt one or two sentence emails, like Hampton Dellinger, the head of the Office of Special Counsel, not the DOJ Special Counsel like Jack Smith, as well as the National Labor Relations Board member Gwen Wilcox and the Merit Systems Protection Board chair, Kathy Harris. These agencies all play a part in protecting federal employees from things like employment abuses and whistleblower retaliation. And when creating these bodies, Congress made clear that their independence was an essential feature for them to properly operate.
Trump is also unilaterally cutting funding from these agencies, a violation of the Impoundment Act, which affirmed Congress's constitutional authority over the federal purse. A group of farmers sued the Trump administration for funding cuts to the USDA.
My name is Laura Beth Resnick, and I own Butterbee Farm in Maryland. We grow cut flowers year-round in greenhouses in our fields. We deliver a van full of flowers to Baltimore and DC twice a week. I run the farm with my husband and a team of seasonal workers.
Resnick spoke with reporters after she filed a lawsuit against the administration. Ryan also covered the complaint, which was filed in DC.
Resnick, along with 4 other farm operators in Maryland, Massachusetts, and Mississippi, challenged a funding freeze that was ordered by Trump's, quote, Unleashing American Energy executive order, one of the 41 he issued on Inauguration Day that targeted programs under Joe Biden's Keystone Inflation Reduction Act. They argue that the USDA paused their funding per a White House Office of Management and Budget memo, which put a blanket pause on all federal funds. Then, after a federal judge here in D.C. ruled that the OMB pause was likely unconstitutional, the USDA has since relied on Trump's executive order for justification.
What did Resnick plan to buy with her federal grant?
She received a grant for solar panels for her greenhouses, which require a lot of electricity and run year-round. I'd never thought of this before, but Resnick pointed out that all the big holidays for cut flowers are in or shortly after winter. Think Valentine's Day, Easter.
We learned that if we put solar panels on our barn, we would save about $5,000 a year. We signed the contract for the program in August of last year. We paid our half of the project, about $36,000, and expected to get the other half when the project was complete. The solar panels went on the farm. They're up on the barn now. They are operating. And about a month after they were operating, we requested our funding from the government. The request happened to be the same week that the funding freeze was announced, and we were informed from the USDA that our funding had been rejected due to the freeze. We would not have entered into this contract if we thought that the funds wouldn't be provided. We need our contract honored by the government so that we're not deeply in debt. We owe the solar company about $36,000, which we do not have, and we need our funding unfrozen so that we can pay them. Like so many other farmers, we're in a holding pattern until the administration honors their end of our contract. Farming has such slim profit margins as it is, and USDA assistance like loans and grants have been crucial to our business.
Resnick's case is still pending in federal court, but the head of the special counsel's office, Hampton Dellinger's case, briefly came up to the Supreme Court. The justices dodged his application, and he ultimately withdrew his lawsuit after an adverse ruling from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals.
Kelsey, you started by talking about the Supreme Court's ruling on presidential immunity. But even before that, I remember this idea of the unitary executive theory being kicked around during Trump's first term.
Yes, the first time Trump was impeached, one of his arguments in defense of the Ukraine phone call was that the president has unitary power over the executive branch. And if he wants to make phone calls and offer missiles in return for dirt on his opponents, he can. I'll note, though, that legal experts say that argument is extreme. While Trump is flexing his presidential authority like no prior office holder, he really just is taking advantage of what the Supreme Court has been working on for over a decade. Jed Sugarman, a law professor at Boston University, connected opposition to the administrative state, sometimes called the deep state depending on your news preferences, to the buildup of executive power. The administrative state describes federal agencies and bureaus that fall under the executive branch.
This is part of a broader constitutional agenda where, listeners might also recognize such legal doctrines that maybe people did not know about 10 years ago, but things like the non-delegation doctrine or the major questions doctrine. These are all, along with the unitary executive theory, all ways of cutting back on the regulatory agencies in the administrative state. So on the one hand, there is a push to interpret the Constitution that to have three branches, and that what they do is they critique the administrative state and these independent agencies and expertise as having become a fourth branch. And by fourth branch, they mean an unconstitutional branch. Now, as a historian, I can tell you, as someone who's studied the founding on the origins of the executive branch, administrative power, the founders not only expected an administrative state. In the first Congress, they started creating and planning for relatively independent members of Treasury. Madison himself wanted an independent comptroller, etc. I mean, I can go into the weeds on this. But the point is that the founders expected a growing administrative state. At the same time, what we have now in the 21st century is nothing that the founders could have imagined. But cell phones are not something, or airplanes and cars are not things that are things that the founders could have imagined. So there is a truth in between the two sides. It's just that the unitary executive theory pretends like this was decided by the founders as opposed to their own modern critique of the administrative state.
Operating under that mindset, the Roberts Court has slowly shifted authority away from administrative agencies and toward the president. In 2010, the court ruled in a case known as Free Enterprise Fund versus Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. And they said that Congress unlawfully protected a financial oversight board from presidential removal. Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the opinion for the court, said for-cause removal protections insulated the board members from presidential oversight, preventing the president from faithfully executing his oath of office. A decade later, in Saylor Law versus Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Roberts cemented a legal rule barring any statute that limits the president's ability to oversee the executive branch. However, a 90-year-old precedent protecting federal agencies is still on the books, which is why Humphrey's executor versus United States is at the center of a lot of these legal fights. Humphrey was a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission when President Roosevelt asked for his resignation. Humphrey was a conservative and had jurisdiction over many of Roosevelt's New Deal policies. When Humphrey refused to resign, Roosevelt fired him because of his policy positions. However, Humphrey was protected from at-will termination. Sounds familiar, right? In 1935, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the Federal Trade Commission Act, which gave Humphrey protection from termination, was constitutional. The justices said Humphrey's dismissal on policy grounds was unjustified, and that the Constitution had never given the president unlimited power of removal. Trump has already said that he doesn't believe Humphrey's executor to be good law, and the Department of Justice sent a letter to Congress stating just that. Since the Supreme Court will ultimately be the final arbiter here, though, the goal seems to be to bring a case up to the justices. Ryan, are you seeing any cases that might float up my way?
Absolutely. The D.C. Circuit, they've already stepped into 3 cases that deal directly with Humphrey's executor. Specifically, the terminations of Office of Special Counsel Head Hampton Dellinger, Merit Systems Protection Board Chair Kathy Harris, and National Labor Relations Board member Gwen Wilcox. During oral arguments in Harris and Wilcox's consolidated case in March, the Justice Department heavily relied on Saylor Law v. CFPB and Collins v. Yellen to support Trump's authority to remove the officials at will. In Collins, a 2021 case, the Supreme Court held that Congress had wrongfully restricted the president's authority to remove the Federal Housing Finance Agency's director in violation of the separation of powers following the 2008 financial crisis. The government cited the 2 cases as evidence that the Supreme Court has, on the one hand, limited Humphrey's reach, and on the other, indicated that Humphreys may be on the way out. U.S. Circuit Judge Justin Walker, who's a Trump appointee, said during arguments that Humphrey's current status was like being inside the trash compactor in Star Wars, saying that while it was still alive, the walls around it were slowly but surely closing in.
How does Trump v. United States fit in with all of this? That was about immunity from criminal charges, but these cases focus on administrative power.
The Department of Justice is already making the argument that the immunity ruling means that presidents don't have criminal or civil legislative restraints. Sozan, from the Center for American Progress, said presidential immunity removes the remaining limits preventing presidents from seizing broad power.
The Supreme Court, the current extremists on it who control it, essentially made presidents into kings with a decision last year in Trump versus United States. So that really puts the unitary executive theory on steroids in some sense. Other presidents have tried to amass power, but what we're seeing now from the Trump administration is completely on steroids. It's of a whole different beast than what any prior president has tried to do. We're seeing the smashing of guardrails. We're seeing the defiance of political norms, and we're seeing the defiance of laws and the Constitution. And I think what the Trump administration is trying to do is stress test as many of the guardrails as possible. It's blowing through some of them, it's pushing on some of them, it's pulling on some of them. There's this deluge of activity from the Trump administration to try to test all of these boundaries. But it's a real stress test for our democracy right now.
I'm hearing a whole lot about Trump and the Supreme Court. But if Schoolhouse Rock taught me anything, it seems we've forgotten an important player here.
In my defense, it's easy to do so these days. Congress has been largely sidelined in the last few years.
Trump has cited Republican majorities in the House of Representatives and the Senate, along with his victory, of course, as the American public's mandate for change. How can the legislative branch not play a role here?
I think the better question is why Trump would need to experiment with executive power when congressional legislation provides a much more legally sound and long-lasting solution. It's high time for a full Courthouse News DC sidebar takeover. Ben Weiss, our congressional reporter, has braved the infamous Capitol Hill scrums to bring us some answers. Ben, how are lawmakers reacting to Trump's executive orders?
Well, Congress is certainly on the sidelines here, but it's not like they've been sent kicking and screaming to the timeout corner. Republican leadership in the House and Senate, remember, they have majorities in both chambers, have been reticent to assert their constitutional authority over some of the Trump administration's more aggressive actions. The White House's shuttering of USAID is one such example. House Speaker Mike Johnson said at the time that he didn't see a move to close the agency, which since 1998 has been under Congress's purview, as an encroachment on Article 1 authority. And like most GOP lawmakers have, he framed it as a necessary audit of an agency wasting taxpayer dollars. Never mind that USAID spending represents roughly 1% of annual government spending. Senate Majority Leader John Thune took a less direct tack, telling me at the time that he thought the president had the right to review how executive agencies spend their money. He also cast doubt on this idea that the Trump administration is trying to close USAID, but that aged like milk. Congressional Republicans have signaled that they might be willing to thump their constitutional powers on some issues. Speaker Johnson, for example, has suggested that if the White House tries to abolish the education department, Congress could pass legislation to ink that move. But the GOP has done very little so far to claw back congressional authority that the Trump administration has already steamrolled.
A lot of times when the Supreme Court reviews federal agency actions, like the EPA setting air quality standards or ATF regulating guns, the justices ask why Congress wasn't involved. Last term, the justices overturned a ban on bump stocks, finding that ATF didn't have the authority to do so. In a concurring opinion, Justice Samuel Alito acknowledged the problem the executive branch was trying to solve, but said the law should have come from Congress. The elephant in the room is that Congress is largely dysfunctional right now. They're lucky if they can pass an interim funding extension, let alone a full budget. It makes more significant changes like gun reform seem like a pipe dream. I asked Charisse Thrower, a political science professor at Vanderbilt University, why the legislative branch is at a standstill.
I think the biggest problem is the degree of partisanship and the degree of polarization in Congress. So you're right that over time, Congress just legislates less, and that's due to the degree of extreme polarization that's happening within Congress.
Ben, can you explain why simple majorities aren't enough for Republicans to pass their agenda?
Well, it all comes down to what those of us in the Hill Press Corps lovingly call Senate math. House Republicans, barring any high-profile defections, of which there have been many in recent years, can pretty much pass major legislation without needing to rely on votes from the Democratic minority. But that's not how things work in the Senate. The upper chamber can't vote on major pieces of legislation, such as budget bills, without first clearing a procedural hurdle known as cloture, which requires 60 votes to pass. With the GOP Senate majority as slim as it is, that necessarily means Republicans need to flip some Democrats if they have any hope of passing Trump's agenda. Democrats in the past have voted for cloture in hopes that advancing Republican legislation will allow them to offer amendments that help to defang some of their most offensive policies. But if Republicans can't get enough Dems on board, or if they refuse to vote to advance a piece of legislation, you end up with a filibuster, which freezes up the whole process.
Olinsky from the Center for American Progress had an interesting statistic on the filibuster.
I believe by 2040, we'll expect to see about 70 senators represent only about 30% of the population of the country, which is really striking, or that 70% of the country, like in terms of population, will only have 30 senators representing them. And so when you have the filibuster, it stops the government from being responsive to the people's needs, and that can be a barrier to making forward motion on issues that people care about.
The collision of partisanship, polarization, and weird Senate rules works against coalition building. Some legal scholars have posited that the two-party system conflicts with the democratic system. Ben, how does that theory compare to your reporting? Any potential coalitions forming?
Yeah, I mean, with divisions as deep as they are between Democrats and Republicans, it's hard to imagine any sort of cross-aisle coalition that blends subsets of the two parties into some third entity. And both parties also speak about the other's agenda using such apocalyptic language, anti-democratic, anti-American, that you can see the middle ground vanishing in real time. That's not to say that lawmakers don't undertake bipartisan ventures. You see Democratic and Republican lawmakers co-sponsoring bills together all the time, many of which ultimately become law. But when it comes to the big ticket, the direction of the country, these partisan divisions make it difficult to build out a third option for voters who feel left out by the two-party system.
Olinsky said that even off the floor, lawmakers are more divided than ever.
I remember I worked for Senator Kennedy on the Health Committee in the Senate, and I remember observing several times him being in a fierce debate on the Senate floor with Orrin Hatch, who at that point was seen as the polar opposite, right? An arch conservative who generally was on the other side of most issues. And after some of these fiery tirades on the floor that were principled by both of them, they'd come off the floor and they would slap each other's backs and go get lunch. And it also happened to be those two adversaries who came together in a principled way to create the Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP, to make sure that many fewer kids would be uninsured. And you don't see that same kind of camaraderie and comedy in the body anymore. I think it was a significant turning point when then Republican leader Mitch McConnell said that his number one priority when Barack Obama was elected president was to make him only a one-term president. That kind of approach makes it really hard to legislate.
Stalking the Capitol halls every day, you do see moments of levity between members of Congress from both parties. I'm thinking about the number of times I've seen Cory Booker share a laugh with a Republican colleague outside the Senate chamber. But more and more, those episodes feel like a bug rather than a feature of politics.
It makes sense that legislation is harder to pass, but why would lawmakers willingly let the president dictate spending when that's kind of their whole job?
Professor Thrower said other factors might seem more pressing for lawmakers.
Well, you just have to think about, are there other incentives that outweigh that? So particularly for members of Congress who have to be reelected and are very much dependent on their constituents and depending on public opinion. And the fact that those electoral incentives are driving much of their decision making, you can see that being a stronger motivation for protecting their institutional power. Because at the end of the day, you can care about Congress as an institution, but if you're not reelected to it, then the incentives to protect the institution might be eroded.
Let's see if I've got this right. Trump is passing his agenda with an untested theory of executive authority that the Supreme Court gave him while Congress is in a timeout because they can't make friends.
Close enough. Trump's utilization of the unitary executive unveiled cracks, if not full-on fractures, in the democratic system.
Besides Schoolhouse Rock becoming obsolete, what does that mean?
We're already starting to see the consequences. Olinsky pointed to New York Mayor Eric Adams's bribery case as one example.
When you grab power from other branches of government, it's because you want to use it. And so what does that look like practically? One, and I would say in many cases, these are inappropriate and often illegal kinds of things they're trying to do. But one, there was a case that the Department of Justice was bringing against Mayor Adams in New York City around bribery, and the administration decided, the politicals decided they wanted to dismiss that, but without prejudice, abusing the prosecutorial authority in order to basically lean on Mayor Adams to deliver policies that they liked around immigration. And the reason they wanted to do it without prejudice was so that they could always rebring those charges at a later date, holding it like a cudgel over his head. That's not how we do things, right, in a democracy.
This sounds a lot like the weaponization of government. I've heard of that somewhere before.
I do not doubt that Jim Jordan and the rest of his congressional committee will be looking into it. For American democracy, the cudgel is whether Trump will abide by court orders. Professor Sugarman said Trump is already stepping over the line, and so far he's getting away with it. We saw this in the foreign aid funding case, where a federal judge and then the Supreme Court had to force Trump to comply with a ruling restarting funding for contractors. While the majority ruled against Trump, 4 justices led by Justice Samuel Alito would have let the administration ignore the order.
Such broad unitary executive theory that the next stage is the president's not only above Congress, the president's above the court, which means the president's above the law.
Which is exactly what Justice Sotomayor anticipated.
Ironic, isn't it? The man in charge of enforcing laws can now just break them.
Thank you, Kelsey, for your reporting. Sounds like this administration will be keeping you and the rest of the DC Bureau busy for years to come. Like we mentioned at the start of this episode, we're not even at the 100-day mark of the new administration. While the president is testing the limits of the Constitution, legal challenges to his actions are more common than ever. Several federal judges have blocked portions of the president's overwhelming barrage of executive orders. But what happens when Trump begins to target the civil lawsuits and lawyers whose legal challenges impede the rollout of his MAGA agenda? In our next episode, reporter Josh Russell takes a look at Trump's pushback to the pushback, including his targeted attacks against law firms and broader retribution at those resistance lawsuits by potentially forcing plaintiffs who sue the government to put up enormous sums of money just to proceed with their case. If you like this episode and are looking for more, please head on over to courthousenews.com and make sure to follow us on social media. That's all for now. See you next time.